So, just in case David sees this recording, thank you, David, for your presentation. Next up, we have a local of Buffalo. We have Mr. Jajean Rose-Burney joining us. Jajean serves as Deputy Executive Director of the Western New York Land Conservancy, and after graduating in 2007, Jajean worked on the Urban Design Project, a research center here at UB, on several local planning efforts, environmental coalition building, and nonprofit development. As a graduate student, Jajean studied the Sustainable Futures Program in Costa Rica, and from 2010 to 2012, he served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Puebla, Mexico, along with his wife, Anna. So, Jajean, without further ado, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kay. Thanks, Kim, for inviting me to be here. It's really exciting to be at this point. I think you probably already heard that we sort of started this idea 6 years ago. And I don't think any of us thought it would take 6 years, or at least I didn't tell my boss it would take 6 years. So I'm born and raised in Buffalo. I went to Peace Corps in Mexico with my wife in 2010, 2012, and I was fortunate enough to be able to work on a Ramsar site there. I came back and started thinking, well, why isn't the Niagara River a Ramsar site? I knew Linda Schneekloff, Carrie Mitchell. They had been working on this idea of sort of an international designation for the river, maybe a peace park. They've been doing that for a long time. I started talking to them. We started thinking, well, maybe Ramsar could be a tool for getting to that point. And so I called the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I knew enough about Ramsar to know that I should call the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They said, do you know that one of the preeminent Ramsar scholars in the world happens to be at UB? And I said, I didn't know that. So that's how we met Kim. 6 years later, here we are. It was a tough process, but it was rewarding and fun, and obviously it's exciting to get to this point. So thank you everyone who was involved. And is it real yet?
I know it seems like a dream, but we're like literally 24 hours away.
24 hours away.
I got the certificate.
So as of tomorrow, past tense, as of today, future Ramsar site. So my presentation is about why Niagara. Why does Niagara deserve to be a Ramsar site? And this is a little bit of a technical presentation based on the 9 criteria to become a Ramsar site. And I wanted to first start off with, well, what is the site? So we were talking a little bit about today about this international transboundary Ramsar site. Today, we're focusing on the U.S. side. We happen to be the first to be designated, hopefully, over the next year. I'll tell my boss again, it might be a couple months. I don't know how long it'll take. But over the next year, we hope to have both sides of the river designated and have a transboundary site. So the U.S. side of the river, just to get a sense of what the boundary is, and then where this data that I'm going to be presented comes from, is basically the entire river, Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, and all of the protected green spaces along the edges. So one question we had early on, and came from a lot of people, is, well, is the Niagara River a wetland? Ramsar is about wetlands. And so Ramsar has a very broad definition of what a wetland is, essentially any sort of wet ecosystem. Coral reefs, beaches, and then obviously your cattail marshes. So the Niagara River waterfalls, they count. So that was the first hurdle. We got through that. The Niagara River counts. It's a wetland. So we included the entire river. We included the protected green spaces along the edges because those protected green spaces contribute to the ecological functioning of the river. They're part of the watershed. I think one thing that I thought is funny, the Ramsar Convention encourages sites to include as much of the watershed as possible. So the Niagara River watershed is pretty large. That wasn't very realistic. That's the Great Lakes Basin. But we said, well, let's include the green spaces along the edges that are protected. So that's what the boundary looks like. And the map, it's hard to read because it's a very long, complicated, weirdly winding boundary that's based on political borders and a river that, kind of a winding river. And so you probably can't see the details, but that's the explanation for the boundary. So what are the Ramsar criteria? And this is the list of the criteria. This is my simplified version of explaining the criteria so that it sort of makes sense and fits on a slide, because the actual criteria names are much longer, and you'll see those in a second. So first, is it representative, rare, or unique? Is it a special place? Does it support vulnerable or endangered species or threatened ecological communities? Are there protected plants and animals there? Does it support keystone or endemic species that only exist in this place, or species that are really critical to the functioning of this place? Does it support species at a critical stage in their life cycle? So the examples that I would use are migration or breeding or nesting. Does it support 20,000 or more water birds? So that's just a very straightforward number. Count them if you need that number. And water birds, I think, is again sort of broadly defined. It can be shorebirds, waterfowl, birds that use wet areas. Herons, for example. So, does it support 1% of the individuals in a population of one species of water bird? So, more than 1% of the total population of a species of one of those birds. Does it support a significant proportion of indigenous fish species? So native fish, you have a lot of species of native fish at the site. Is it an important food source, spawning ground, or nursery, or migration path for those fish? And then does it support 1% of the individuals in a population of one species or subspecies of wetland-dependent, non-avian animal species? I guess I didn't simplify that one, but basically that's saying, do you support a lot of, more than 1% of a species that isn't a bird, is basically what that means. And so the Niagara River on the US side meets 8 of the 9 Ramsar criteria. And I'll get to this at the end, but the Canadian side actually meets all 9. And I'll explain why at the end. It's a little bit of a quirk of how this works, but we meet 8 of 9. The Niagara, or the Canadian side, meets 9 of 9. Very few other sites in the world meet that many criteria. And I think I sat down to do this presentation on Sunday and thought it might be easy for me to go through the list of all the sites and figure out how many others have 8 criteria. Not easy at all. I'd have to read each, basically application one by one. There's how many, 2,000 some?
Yeah, quite a few.
So basically I stopped. What I wanted to say is we were the first in the US to have 8 criteria. I found one at like my 10th try, so we're not, but very few sites is I think a scientifically accurate way of framing it. So here's the criteria, and I'm not going to read this, but again, this is this place special? Is it unique? And this is maybe the easiest one for us to answer and qualify for. Niagara Falls, it's the largest waterfall by volume in North America. There's nothing like Niagara Falls in the world. We count, we qualify. And then there's a lot of smaller things. There's remnant cattail marshes at Tift. Portions of what used to be a much larger cattail marsh at this part of the Lake Erie. The New York State Department of State has designated several areas as significant coastal fish and wildlife habitats, a lot of spawning fish, important habitat, subaquatic vegetation, a lot of little things that make us count for this as well, but Niagara Falls is just kind of a no-brainer. The second criteria, are there protected species? And so the first thing I'd just like to go through is the list of species that we've been able to document. And this is our work, it's sort of compiling data from many other sources. But there's 338 species of birds reported at the site, 100 species of fish, 31 species of mammals, 11 species of reptiles, 13 species of amphibians, 12 species of mussels, and 231 species of plants. And I think with all of these, this is sort of the data that we were able to collect. There's probably more species. And I know, for instance, with plants, there are a lot more species of plants just in the Niagara Gorge. I just didn't have the records. We didn't have the records. But anyways, these lists continue to grow, and there's more data out there than we were able to access. But anyways, of that data, 21 of those species are listed in CITES, so the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. 7 are listed in the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Red List. 1 is protected federally in the U.S., so that's the piping plover. 45 are protected in New York State at various different levels of endangered, threatened, special concern. And this bald eagle is just one example. The bald eagle nests on Strawberry Island. It nests on Navy Island on the Canadian side. This is sort of an iconic protected species that sort of, in a lot of ways, represents the importance of the river. So this third criteria is about whether or not you have keystone species. And I think we probably could have found several keystone species that are really critical to the functioning of the whole ecosystem. But for the purposes of this application, we focused on the emerald shiner, which is a small minnow that exists in the Niagara River and is the main food source for the common tern, which is a threatened species. And the emerald shiner, each year its population kind of fluctuates. When I came back from Mexico 7 years ago, in different places along the river looking at birds, you just see clouds of emerald shiners in the river, at the locks at the Black Rock Canal. It was incredible. And unfortunately, I think one of our steering committee members, well, not unfortunately, but she had been doing research on the emerald shiner Alicia Perez Fuentetaja at Bus State, and the populations have really declined over the last 7 years. I don't think we're not entirely sure why, and I think there's a lot of information missing about the life cycle of the shiner to really understand where the problem is coming from. But the hardening of the shorelines, the increase in water temperatures, the invasive species, there's a lot of likely causes. But the emerald shiner is still there. It's still the main food source of the common tern. The common tern still persists. And so that's a keystone species that we have. This criteria is, does the site sustain species during a critical stage of their life cycle? So again, we looked at migration and nesting and spawning. There are at least 137 species of birds that nest along the Niagara River corridor. 42 of those are water birds, and 7 are considered colonial nesting water birds. So your great egrets, your double-crested cormorants. So yes. There are 232 species of birds that are considered migratory that pass through here at different times of the year. 106 of those are considered water birds. And in the image that I have on the slideshow here, I don't know if anyone has seen this, but I'm a bird watcher. I go looking at birds. Spring and fall migrations are incredible. Winter here is incredible. You can see birds migrating on radar right here along the Niagara River, and that's what this is a picture of. This isn't rain, this isn't snow, this is birds. So in spring, in May, songbirds, they migrate at night. What you see on radar, and you can see this clearly when there's no rain, is that at dusk, these birds lift off, they fly around the lakes, up the river, and some of them cross the river. And you can literally see these clouds of birds taking off on radar over the course of the first hour after the sun sets. And what's really cool, the Niagara River is really special because of this corridor, because of this migration corridor. But you can even see this along the entire eastern coast. If you go to the NOAA or the Weather Channel right after dusk, say 9 o'clock on a May evening, you can watch as blooms of birds lift off everywhere there's a Doppler radar station along the east coast. It's really incredible, and you can just watch birds fly across the river, fly across the lake, and go around the lake. There are 92 species of birds that overwinter at the site, and 40 of those are water birds. And this is something that makes the Niagara River really, really special. So in most places in December, January, February in the Northeast, your water is going to be frozen. Fresh water is going to be frozen. It's cold. The Niagara River stays open year-round. It's because it's flowing fast. It's cold here, but the water stays open. And so what you get is these huge congregations of waterfowl, of ducks, of gulls that need to eat, whether it's fish or mollusks or subaquatic vegetation, but they need open water to be able to find that. And they can only find that at the Niagara River, within thousands of miles, or maybe 1,000 miles. There are very few places where they're going to find open water in the middle of the winter. And so I go out bird watching all the time in January, February, in the middle of winter. It's very cold, and you sort of have to really like birds. But you're going to see these huge clouds. It's like, I've always said someone should do a documentary about the Niagara River, like one of these National Geographic documentaries. I mean, you see icebergs floating down the river. You see these huge clouds of birds diving in and out, flying. I mean, it really is like being in Alaska or the Arctic Ocean. There's nothing like it in the world, and that's how we qualify for this criteria. There's 41 species of fish that spawn in the river too, so this isn't just about birds, this criteria, and there's data that shows 41 species of fish spawn in the river. So, talking about birds again, so a wetland should be considered internationally important if it supports 20,000 or more water birds. Now, we have counts. So the Niagara River is also designated as a globally significant important bird area, and so a lot of data research has already been done and compiled for us. So that designation, I'll put the Niagara River on par with places like the Galapagos and the Everglades that also have that designation, and it was because of the birds, and in particular the gulls and the waterfowl. So in one day, there was a count of 100,000 gulls in the Niagara River. There's 19 species of gulls in the Niagara River. Australia has fewer species than that. And a lot of people think gulls are like that one thing that eats hamburgers in the burger parking lot. They look very different. Some of them don't look very different at all. Sometimes it's really fun and hard to distinguish the different species, but there's 19 very different species of gulls in the Niagara River. And then a count of 20,000 waterfowl. And I think that 20,000 waterfowl count is probably very low. And I think, I've seen flocks of tens of thousands of greater scoff You know, I don't know, it'd probably not be hard to get to 20,000 just by counting Canada geese and cormorants. So we meet that criteria. It should be important or considered a Ramsar site if it supports 1% or more of the global population of a specific water bird, and the Niagara River has 6 water birds that are here in levels greater than 1% of their global population. And the one that I'll call out is the Bonaparte's gull, and that's what this is a photo of. So each year, the number of birds that come through here fluctuates. There's weather patterns, there's food sources, giant populations are up or down, ice is greater or less, they hit a storm or they don't. But some years, one year, the Bonaparte gull population, where they counted 100,000 Bonaparte's gulls on the Niagara River. So that's more than 25% of its global population. And the Bonaparte's gull, it's migrating through. It's I think, the only gull that nests in trees. And it nests in the boreal forests in northern Canada and Alaska, flies to the east coast and comes through the Niagara River on its way south and then on its way back north. And so it's just an incredible life story. This gull that nests in trees that lives up in Alaska that eats insects during the summer, it's, eating those giant mosquitoes. And here it eats the fish in the water. Water's open, it's not frozen, and more than 25% of its global population has been counted here in one single year. So fish. Should be important if it has a large number of indigenous fish. So the Niagara River has at least 89 species of indigenous freshwater fish. There are several invasive fish species too. I think the total number of fish counted or species is about 100, but 89 of those are native. These are just some examples. I had one of the, I grew up here. I've been on the river. I go there all the time, and I had one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had on the river just this year, something I'd never seen before. And they're lake sturgeon, so these massive 6-7 foot long fish. The top right photo here, they spawn in the Niagara River, both in the upper river and the lower river. And at the right time of year, you can go down to the river and you can see these massive fish just floating by you. You don't have to go out fishing, you don't have to have a boat. You just have to walk to this little pathway, and I've been sworn to secrecy about where it is because it's a very threatened species and they're still poaching. But it's actually not that hard to find, and there are a lot of places you can go. And it really was incredible to see this massive fish that has basically evolved to have armor because when it evolved, it was defending itself against dinosaurs. And it's still here, and it still has armor. Muskie, this is an example of a fish that's very important to the recreational fishery. In the Niagara River. There are a lot of fishing charters, a lot of people just do it on their own. All of this is important for recreation and tourism and economic development, and protecting it will sustain all of those industries. And this last criteria, so I mentioned the US side does not meet this criteria. We're at 8 of 9, the Canadian side is 9 of 9, and it's because on the Canadian side, in the gorge, there is a subpopulation of what's called the northern dusky salamander. So we have the northern dusky salamander on our side too. In the Canadian side, it's the only place in Canada where this species is found. So they meet criteria number 9, and we don't. I think, so this is sort of how we meet the criteria. This is how you become a Ramsar site. Do we meet the criteria? 8 of 9. But there's so much more about the Niagara River that isn't just sort of the technical side of these criteria. And then there's the cultural side, there's the history side. There's millennia, thousands of years of indigenous cultures have lived here. We have had, the birthplace of hydroelectric energy, the home of Love Canal, and maybe the birthplace of the modern environmental justice movement. 200 years of peace along an international border. Olmsted Parks, the first state park. You're welcome, right? This is an incredible place, and I think we're really lucky to be able to get the Ramsar designation, and I hope it's something that we can use to promote what's here, celebrate this, tell the world, and improve conservation here. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions for Jajean? I guess I'll go ahead and start then and field you one. It's somewhat of a plug for Fish and Wildlife. As you know, in Fish and Wildlife, we've been really focused on sites that meet really 4 very general things. Does the site promote jobs? recreation, education, and conservation. And when we got this application, I was pleased to see that Niagara meets all of those things in spades. And as you had said at the end of your presentation, sure, there's a lot of this biological and conservation significance, but could you speak a little bit about just sort of what does it mean to the people of Niagara and the communities here?
Oh, sure.
Oh.
I mean, I certainly can't speak to that in a short amount of time.
Okay.
But what's I think really cool and maybe unique about this designation is that it was kind of from the bottom up.
Right.
I think when I look at a lot of the other Ramsar sites in the U.S., a lot of them, first off, you might have one owner. Sometimes that owner is, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or National Park Service. This came from a steering committee of people, of individuals, of organizations that said the Niagara River really is special. And what do we do about it? How do we get this designation? How do we promote it? There's so much work going on along the Niagara River, along the corridor, at so many different levels, that I think that I didn't even really sort of understand that until we started talking about it.
Yeah.
And when I started talking about it, and you all seemed very impressed, I said, maybe this is something that maybe this is impressive. All of these not-for-profits, the Waterkeeper, Olmsted Parks Conservancy, the Land Conservancy, doing conservation, doing restoration, creating the Buffalo Blueways, a new paddle sport trail, cleaning up the Buffalo River, TIFT, managing a nature preserve, and then you've got the agencies, towns, cities, with their own parks, with their own initiatives, the state parks. A lot of the land that's within this site are state parks, the Niagara Gorge, Niagara Falls, Buckhorn, Beaver Island State Park, the DEC doing restoration, creating new islands in the river. Buffalo Audubon Society is creating a new tern nesting island in the river. The Greenway, with $500 million of settlement funds from the New York Power Authority to be spent on all sorts of things, including restoration and environment and public access. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is a federal funding source that has been spent on conservation and restoration here. Individual municipalities and state agencies, Buffalo Billion. There's so many different, and that's just the U.S. side, right? There's so much, and it's all coming from people, and you go out there, spring or fall, you see hundreds of bird watchers. You go out there probably today, and you see people fishing, boats, charters. In the winter, in the middle of the winter, you've got people ice fishing. There's no time of the year where the Niagara River isn't really important to people. And then there's the cultural history, there's the Underground Railroad, there's new museums, there's research, the Niagara University, Buff State, UB, where to stop and where to start,
Right.
But it's and home to more than 1 million people in 2 countries, and First Peoples, and it's an incredible place.
I think that, you saying all that speaks to why this designation, but also the Ramsar Convention broadly, truly is bipartisan and is welcomed by all different varieties of political takes, in part because it's not any one thing, it's so many amorphous things, and really Niagara highlights that in an extraordinary way. So thank you. Are there other questions? You, sir.
Yeah, I think you made mention of them encouraging protection of the whole watershed.
Mm-hmm.
Does that then potentially include the Tonawanda Creek watershed and maybe Elephant Creek?
Well, it's sort of an ambiguous directive, I suppose, from the Ramsar Convention. Is what they're promoting conservation and the wide use of wetlands. So it's not strict, keep people out. It's a combination of use these wetlands, conserve them, but use them sustainably, I suppose, is the best way to put it. And they want you to then consider, when you're considering a wetland, what is the boundary of the wetland? This is not like doing a DEC delineation where hydric soils and certain plant species equal wetland boundary. It's not like a federal wetland. So it's a little bit up to you about how you define what the boundary of the wetland is. But what they want you to do is consider everything that impacts the wetland. And so that's when you get into how far up the watershed can you go? And for the purposes of this, because of, I suppose, first off, the Niagara River watershed, which you could consider that the Great Lakes Basin, you can consider that the streams, in western New York. And then when you get into how you designate a Ramsar site, you need the endorsement of every landowner within the wetland. And so we stuck to the river itself, the protected green spaces along the river, and then that's we still got an endorsement from every city, town, village, county along the way, the state. So essentially it just becomes, I would love to include the entire basin, I would love to include the Tonawanda River, but then it's just the complexity of actually pulling that off would make it very difficult. But yeah, technically Tonawanda River could be a Ramsar site. Creek, sorry, yeah.
You bet, man.
I was just curious to know what impact it would have on your educational mission and your interpretive mission to recognize that the Niagara River is actually not a river. And
That's
it's
straight. Well, you see, I mean, yeah.
But the point is,
Yeah.
that it's actually an extension of the lakes.
Right.
And when you talk about creeks, Tonawanda Creek, Black Creek, Chippewa Creek on the Canadian side, those are sort of perpendicular creeks that come in, and
Mhm.
that area there, the Niagara River, actually may be a fault line, and that's why it has very complex geomorphological history. And a lot of the biological amplitude that you have described, which is very exciting and stuff like that, is, I think, not because it's a river, but because it's a strait. But I realize that this is a technicality, and yet scientifically, if you will, it is sort of crucial to understand a lot of the very exciting dynamics of the things that are going along that river. So I was wondering how the word strait and that concept might change or alter your public expression of how exciting this designation might be, because it would involve the people along the upper and lower lakes as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. If you look at the technical report, we obviously identify it as a strait. When I give my public presentations, I call it the river, because that's what everyone knows it as. So I don't know how, I don't have an answer for the question. How does it change what how does it change what created the river, what makes the river important, and how you then describe this? I mean, on a more simplistic level, I always say that what this designation does is not protect the river. That's really up to us. But what this does is it demonstrates and proves that the river is one of the most important places in the world, and that's why we're doing this.
Great. I think we are out of time. So,
Yes, just
one more. Yep.
One quick. Sorry, it's not a question, but more of a statement. I think the piece, Jajean, that you were talking about in terms of the reflection of the community and making this a key priority and bottom up from both the education aspect and our students and Professor Connolly's work and the kind of thinking about this from Linda and a bunch of people, but it would not have happened without Jajean every day pushing this piece forward. And so I just really want to call out, sorry Jajean, your leadership, and probably more importantly, we were talking earlier about the importance of persistence and drive in getting this thing over the finish line. So thank you very much.
Thank you.